I had always known that my place in this world was underestimated. Growing up in the poorer side of town, people often assumed that my voice didn't matter, that my opinions were irrelevant, and that my future was already decided by circumstances I hadn't chosen. But I had something they didn't expect, a mind that refused to be silenced and a heart that demanded respect, no matter how intimidating the opposition. The day it happened started like any other, though I already sensed tension in the air. I had been called to the principal's office, a place I had entered before, always feeling smaller than the walls themselves. The director of our school, a man known for his strictness and sharp tongue, was waiting behind a polished desk, flanked by the heavy air of authority and expectation. Students whispered in the hallways as I approached, their curious eyes following me, wondering what trouble had dragged me into his office this time. I took a deep breath, straightened my back, and reminded myself of what I already knew: intelligence isn't measured by wealth, and courage isn't defined by size. I was determined to speak, to defend what was right, and to confront the arrogance of someone who had underestimated me for far too long. As soon as I entered, the director looked up, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of suspicion and superiority. "Sit down," he barked, as though the simple act of being in his office was already an offense. "We need to talk about your behavior in class. It seems you have a habit of questioning authority." I didn't flinch. I met his gaze steadily, knowing that this was my moment. "I question authority when it's unfair," I said calmly, "and I speak when others are silenced. That doesn't make me a problem, it makes me responsible for my actions and my thoughts." He scoffed, leaning back in his chair, clearly amused by my audacity. "You're just a boy from a poor neighborhood. What could you possibly know about responsibility or respect?" The word stung, but I didn't let anger control me. Instead, I leaned forward slightly, my voice steady, confident, and sharp. "Being from a poor neighborhood doesn't make me ignorant, and being young doesn't mean I'm wrong. Wisdom isn't a matter of money or age, it's a matter of understanding, observation, and the courage to act. And I understand when injustice happens, even if it's in your office." A hush fell over the room. I could feel the tension in the air, hear the faint murmurs of students peeking through the door, waiting for what would happen next. The director, accustomed to commanding obedience, was suddenly silent, caught off guard by a truth he hadn't expected to hear from someone like me. And in that silence, I realized something powerful. Courage doesn't just confront authority, it makes it pause, reconsider, and, sometimes, it leaves even the most intimidating figures speechless. The silence in the office was deafening. For the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross the director's face, a hesitation I had never witnessed in all my years at that school. He had grown accustomed to compliance, to fear, to the unquestioning obedience of students who nodded, whispered, and lowered their heads at his every word. But I wasn't one of those students. And for the first time, he was forced to confront someone who refused to be intimidated. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished desk, his fingers steepled together. "You are bold, I'll give you that," he said slowly, almost as if testing whether my words had been rehearsed. "But boldness without respect is dangerous. Do you understand that?" I held his gaze without flinching. "Respect is earned, not demanded," I replied. "And pretending that money, title, or fear gives someone wisdom or authority is not respect, it's control. True respect comes from understanding, from fairness, and from actions that match your words. You have the authority, yes, but that doesn't mean your decisions are beyond question. And when they are unjust, someone has to speak." The director's lips pressed into a thin line. I could see his mind working, calculating, trying to find an angle, a flaw, a way to regain control. But the more he considered it, the less certain he appeared. Students outside the office whispered and shuffled nervously, some pressed their ears to the door, their eyes wide. I could feel the weight of their attention, the invisible pressure of the moment. I realized that this wasn't just about me confronting authority, it was about showing everyone, silently, that courage and wisdom could come from the most unexpected places. "You think you know better than me," he finally said, his voice sharper now, trying to reclaim dominance. "Do you even understand how the world works? Do you know the consequences of defiance?" I straightened in my chair, letting my voice carry the calm, unshakable certainty I had practiced in my mind countless times. "I understand enough to know when something is wrong, and I understand that silence in the face of injustice makes everyone complicit. I may not know everything about the world, but I know enough to see unfairness when it's in front of me, and I won't stay silent. That is not defiance, that is responsibility." He opened his mouth, as if to argue, but then paused. There was a shift in the room, subtle but unmistakable. His usual dominance, the confidence that came from years of unchallenged authority, was fractured. He had no prepared response for a child who spoke truth with clarity and conviction. and for a few seconds, the office seemed to shrink around us, the tension so thick it was almost tangible. I could see him falter further when he noticed the expressions of the students peeking in surprise, admiration, and a kind of awe. They had never seen someone like me stand up so firmly, so unafraid. And in that moment, I realized the power of example. My words weren't just mine anymore, they were being witnessed, absorbed, and understood by those who had thought they were powerless. Finally, the director leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow, measured breath. Perhaps I underestimated you, he admitted, his tone softer, almost grudgingly respectful. But don't mistake courage for knowledge. You have spoken well, but there is much you have yet to learn. I nodded, keeping my composure, though my heart raced with triumph. I will keep learning, I said quietly, but I will also keep speaking when it matters. That is how we grow, not through fear, but through understanding and courage. For the first time, he said nothing more. The silence that followed was not empty, it was filled with unspoken recognition. He had been confronted, challenged, and left without a response that could dismiss the truth I had spoken. In front of everyone, he had been made to pause, to reflect, and for once, to be silent. As I left his office, the whispers of the students followed me down the hallway. Some called my name softly, others simply stared, wide-eyed. And in that moment, I understood something profoundly important. Intelligence, courage, and wisdom are not determined by wealth, status, or appearance. They are determined by the willingness to speak truth, to challenge injustice, and to stand firm when it matters most. I had walked into that office as a boy underestimated by everyone, and I left as someone who had spoken truth in the face of authority, someone who had left even the most imposing figure silent. And as I looked around at the faces of my peers, I realized that the moment had changed more than just me, it had shifted the energy of the entire school. The days after that confrontation were surreal. The hallway whispers turned into conversations, the conversations into debates, and suddenly, I was no longer just the boy from the poor neighborhood. I was the boy who had faced the director and left him speechless. Students who had ignored me, laughed at me, or dismissed me now looked at me differently, some with admiration, some with quiet envy, and others with curiosity I could feel burning in their eyes. Teachers, too, had begun to shift their perception. I noticed subtle changes in their behavior, the way they listened when I spoke, the tone in which they addressed me, the small nods of recognition that had been absent before. I realized that courage is contagious. My stand had not only challenged the director, it had challenged the whole system, exposing a truth that could no longer be ignored. Intelligence and wisdom are not confined to the privileged, nor are they defined by wealth or status. I began to feel a strange mixture of pride and responsibility. Pride because I had spoken my truth and been heard, responsibility because I now understood that my words had consequences beyond myself. Other students began to approach me, seeking advice, asking questions, and even confiding their own frustrations with authority. I realized that I had become a symbol, whether I wanted to or not, a living example that it was possible to confront injustice with wisdom, patience, and courage. The director himself was different now. I could see the subtle changes in his behavior, less harsh, slightly more cautious in his criticisms, more deliberate in his decisions. I didn't need him to acknowledge me openly, the shift was visible in his actions. Even the other teachers seemed more careful, perhaps realizing that the old ways of commanding fear and demanding obedience were no longer effective. But the impact wasn't limited to the adults. Among my peers, I saw something more profound, a spark of empowerment. Students who had felt voiceless began to speak up in class, questioning decisions politely but firmly, expressing their opinions with clarity and confidence. I realized that my act had created a ripple, showing them that intelligence and courage could challenge authority without disrespect. That ripple, I hoped, would grow into a wave that could change the culture of the school. I also discovered that standing up for truth came with challenges. Some peers were skeptical, whispering doubts, trying to undermine my credibility. Others were outright hostile, unwilling to accept that a boy from a poor neighborhood could hold his own against authority. But I had learned in that confrontation how to remain calm, to articulate my ideas clearly, and to maintain respect even in the face of resistance. Every challenge became an opportunity to reinforce the lesson I had learned. True wisdom is a combination of courage, knowledge, and integrity. The moments of doubt, the stares, the occasional laughter, they all became part of a larger narrative. I had become not just a student, but a force of quiet influence. I learned to navigate my new role with care, knowing that every word I spoke, every action I took, could inspire others or invite unnecessary conflict. But I also learned that responsibility was part of the power I now wielded. Courage without responsibility is reckless, but courage paired with wisdom can transform not just oneself, but an entire community. By the end of the semester, the school felt different. The director no longer dominated with fear. Students and teachers alike were more engaged, more willing to question unfairness, and more willing to listen to each other. I saw glimpses of a school where merit, intellect, and integrity mattered more than status, background, or privilege. And in that transformation, I realized that the true victory wasn't in silencing the director, it was in inspiring a culture of respect, dialogue, and courage that could endure long after I graduated. Looking back on that day, I understood something crucial. Wisdom and courage are not loud or flashy. They don't rely on intimidation, wealth, or titles. They are quiet, steady forces that demand attention because they are rooted in truth. And when they are expressed with clarity, conviction, and respect, even the most formidable obstacles, even the most intimidating figures, can be made to pause, to reflect, and sometimes, to be left silent before the power of integrity. By the time the following year rolled around, I realized that my life at school had transformed completely. I wasn't just a student anymore, I had become a symbol of courage, wisdom, and perseverance. Students who had once dismissed me now came to me for guidance, seeking advice on how to navigate the challenges of school and life, especially when they felt voiceless in the face of authority. The experience of standing up to the director had not only changed me, but it had also created a ripple effect that could be felt throughout the entire community. It wasn't easy. Being recognized came with its own pressures. Expectations weighed heavily on my shoulders, and every word I spoke now carried more significance. I had to be careful, deliberate, and thoughtful. One misstep could undermine the credibility I had fought so hard to establish. But I had learned that true influence comes not from intimidation or dominance, but from consistency, integrity, and the courage to speak truth even when it's inconvenient or unpopular. Teachers began to treat students with a newfound respect, knowing that authority could no longer rely on fear alone. I noticed subtle changes in their teaching styles, more open discussions, more room for students to voice opinions, and more emphasis on reasoning rather than compliance. The culture of the school was shifting, and I could feel the pulse of change growing stronger every day. But the impact extended beyond the school walls. I began volunteering in the community, mentoring younger children who, like me, had been underestimated or dismissed because of their background. I shared my story, not as a boast, but as a lesson that intelligence, courage, and perseverance are not determined by wealth, skin color, or social status. I taught them that even when the world seems stacked against you, speaking truth with integrity can change the way people see you and the way you see yourself. Of course, not everyone accepted this transformation. Some adults in the community, threatened by the idea that a boy from a poor neighborhood could inspire others, tried to silence or discredit me. But I had learned how to respond, not with anger, but with clarity, evidence, and calm determination. I realized that resilience is not about confrontation alone, it is about enduring pressure, staying true to your principles, and guiding others by example. One day, the director called me back into his office. I expected a challenge, perhaps an attempt to reassert his authority, but when I entered, I found something unexpected, a man who had changed, just as much as I had. He spoke cautiously, acknowledging my intelligence, insight, and the way I had influenced not just the students, but the culture of the school. His words were measured, almost hesitant, but they carried an unspoken respect that could not be feigned. "You have shown something remarkable," he said, "not just in confronting me, but in the way you've inspired your peers. It's clear you understand responsibility and courage better than most." I nodded, keeping my composure. "Thank you. But respect and courage aren't about silencing anyone, they are about truth, fairness, and the willingness to stand firm. That's what matters most." From that day forward, I realized that leadership isn't about authority or intimidation, it's about integrity, example, and inspiring others to find their own voices. I continued to challenge injustice, advocate for fairness, and mentor others, always mindful of the responsibility that came with being heard. The whispers in the hallways became conversations, the conversations became debates, and the debates became a culture of respect, understanding, and courage. Years later, looking back, I understood the significance of that moment in the director's office. It had been more than a confrontation, it had been a turning point. It had taught me that wisdom is not the exclusive domain of the wealthy, that courage is not defined by size or status, and that true influence comes from the ability to speak truth with clarity and integrity. And in that realization, I also discovered something even deeper, that the power to inspire, to change, and to leave a legacy does not lie in titles, money, or fear. It lies within every person willing to stand, to speak, and to act with courage, even when the world expects them to be silent. That day had shown me that even a boy from the poorest neighborhood, with nothing but knowledge, courage, and determination, could leave a mark that echoed far beyond himself, changing the lives of countless others who dared to listen, believe, and act. The influence I had begun to feel within the walls of my school soon spread beyond them, reaching corners of the community I had never imagined. Word of the boy who had faced the director with courage and left him speechless traveled through neighborhoods, into local gatherings, and even reached people in positions of power who saw my actions as a rare example of integrity in a world often dominated by fear and hierarchy. At first, I was overwhelmed by the attention. I had not acted for recognition, I had acted out of necessity, driven by fairness, truth, and the refusal to be silenced. Yet suddenly, everyone seemed to expect me to represent more than myself. They expected leadership, wisdom, and guidance, and although the weight of that responsibility was heavy, I understood that it was also a unique opportunity to show others, especially children like me, that courage can change lives, that standing up is not just an act of defiance but an act of transformation. With that awareness came new challenges. Not everyone welcomed the idea that a poor, young black boy could wield influence in the school and community. There were whispers of resentment, subtle attempts to undermine my credibility, and even a few adults who tried to manipulate the system to silence my voice. But I had learned long ago that courage is not about avoiding conflict, it is about confronting it wisely, strategically, and unwaveringly. I had also learned to use observation, patience, and reason as my tools, rather than anger or recklessness. I began holding small sessions with students who felt overlooked, unheard, or underestimated. I taught them how to articulate their thoughts, how to present evidence, and how to speak truth respectfully but firmly. Slowly, a network of young voices emerged, each empowered to challenge injustice, each emboldened by the knowledge that they, too, could leave a mark. The ripple effect I had first initiated with the director's office was now becoming a wave, spreading through classrooms, hallways, and neighborhoods, inspiring a new standard for courage and integrity. The director, once my adversary, became an unexpected ally. Though initially hesitant, he began to recognize the positive impact of my actions and encouraged open dialogue within the school. Classes became more interactive, policies were reconsidered, and the culture shifted from one of fear and compliance to one of discussion and accountability. I could see the transformation not just in him, but in the teachers who now treated students with respect, and in the students who learned to trust themselves to speak and act. Outside the school, the effects were equally profound. Community leaders began inviting me to speak at youth programs, mentoring initiatives, and local events. My words were simple but heartfelt. Intelligence is not determined by wealth, courage is not defined by size, and integrity is the true measure of leadership. I shared my story not to glorify myself, but to show that the ability to influence, inspire, and lead is within anyone willing to act with honesty and bravery. Even as recognition grew, I remained grounded in the values that had brought me this far: humility, diligence, and respect for others. I knew that influence is fleeting if it is not earned through consistent actions. I continued my studies, worked tirelessly on my projects, and mentored younger students, always mindful that my role was not to dominate but to empower. Every success I achieved, every problem I helped solve, reinforced a single truth: courage paired with wisdom can transform lives far beyond the immediate moment. Then came a day that felt like a culmination of everything I had worked toward. The school organized a ceremony to honor students who had shown exceptional leadership and courage. When my name was called, I stepped onto the stage, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes upon me. I looked out at the faces of students I had helped guide, teachers who had once doubted, and even the director himself. And for the first time, I fully understood the impact of my journey, not just the confrontation in his office, but every action, every word, and every effort that had followed. I spoke from the heart. Courage is not about being fearless. Wisdom is not about wealth or status. True power comes from standing up for what is right, from speaking truth even when it is difficult, and from lifting others as you rise. We all have the ability to make a difference, no matter where we come from, no matter what we look like, no matter what others expect of us. The applause was thunderous, not just for me, but for the idea I represented, that intelligence, courage, and integrity are universal, and that anyone willing to act on them can leave a lasting legacy. In that moment, I realized that the boy who had once been underestimated, dismissed, and ignored had not just silenced a director, he had inspired a community, shifted a culture, and shown countless others that their voices mattered. And as I stepped down from the stage, I knew that the work was never truly done. Courage and influence are not a single act, they are a lifetime of choices, a continuous commitment to fairness, truth, and empowerment. But I also knew this: the ripple I had started would continue, growing beyond me, shaping others, and reminding the world that even the most unlikely person can stand tall, speak boldly, and leave a mark that cannot be ignored. Years later, when I look back on those days, I could hardly recognize the boy who had once walked nervously into the principal's office. Life had taken me far from that small school building, yet its lessons had followed me everywhere. The courage that had once made my hands tremble when I spoke had evolved into a quiet, steady confidence that guided every decision I made. I was no longer just the boy who silenced the director. That story had become something greater than me, an example retold in classrooms, community gatherings, and youth programs. Teachers used it to inspire their students, parents whispered it to their children as a reminder that dignity and strength can emerge from even the humblest beginnings. Some even called it the moment the school changed forever. But for me, it was never about fame or recognition. It was about transformation, mine, and everyone else's. The confrontation had planted seeds in the minds of those who witnessed it, and over the years, I watched those seeds grow into forests of courage. Students who had once been too afraid to raise their hands became leaders, thinkers, advocates. Some went on to start community projects, others became teachers, activists, or mentors. The ripple had turned into a current, one that could not be stopped. As I got older, I began speaking in schools across the city. I shared my story, not as a tale of rebel lion, but as one of awakening. I told them that speaking truth isn't about disrespect, it's about balance, integrity, and accountability. I reminded them that authority is not meant to suppress, but to guide, and that wisdom belongs to anyone willing to listen, learn, and act with courage. One of my proudest moments came years later when I was invited back to the very school where everything had begun. The building looked smaller now, its walls worn with time, but its spirit was alive, different, brighter. There were murals painted by students, quotes about courage and truth written on classroom doors, and an atmosphere of respect I could feel the moment I walked in. The director had retired long ago, but his portrait still hung in the main hallway, beside a new one, mine. I stared at it for a long time, overwhelmed. Beneath the portrait were the words that defined my journey: true wisdom is not measured by wealth or position, but by the courage to speak the truth when silence is easier. I was invited to speak to the students that day. Standing on the same stage where I had once received my award, I felt the ghosts of my younger self, the fear, the doubt, the defiance, all standing beside me. I looked out at hundreds of faces, young and eager, faces that reminded me of who I had once been. I stood where you are now, I began, my voice steady but full of emotion. And once, I believed my voice didn't matter. I thought being poor, being different, meant being invisible. But I learned something powerful: that truth, when spoken with courage and purpose, can shake even the strongest walls. You are never powerless, no matter where you come from. The power to change your world lies right here. I placed my hand over my heart. It lives inside you. The room was silent, utterly still, until one by one, the students began to clap. It started softly, then grew louder, until it became a thunderous sound that filled the hall and echoed in my chest. I felt tears burning behind my eyes, not from pride, but from gratitude, from the realization that the fight I had once fought alone had become something shared, something far bigger than me. After the assembly, several students came up to me. Some were shy, others bold, but all of them said the same thing: you made me believe I can speak, too. That was the moment I understood the full meaning of legacy. It wasn't about my name, or the story of silencing a director. It was about the spark that had been lit and passed forward, a chain of courage that would continue long after I was gone. In the years that followed, I built a foundation dedicated to empowering underprivileged students. We offered scholarships, mentoring programs, and workshops that taught not just academic knowledge, but emotional intelligence, critical thinking, and moral courage. Our motto was simple yet powerful: think deeply, speak bravely, act justly. The foundation grew beyond my expectations. Communities across the country adopted our programs, and students who once felt forgotten began to find their voices. I saw the same fire in them that had once burned in me: the desire to be seen, to be heard, to matter. And sometimes, late at night, I would sit by my desk and read letters sent from students who had been helped by the foundation. Many of them began with the same words: I heard your story. Each time I read those words, I smiled, because I knew what they really meant. They meant that the story had never truly been mine. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told they were less, everyone who had ever been silenced, and everyone who had ever decided to rise anyway. And though I had faced many battles since that day in the principal's office, none had shaped me more deeply than that first act of courage. It had taught me that wisdom is not in knowing all the answers, but in daring to ask the questions no one else will. It had shown me that silence, when broken by truth, can echo for generations. And so, as the years passed, I carried that truth with me into every speech, every classroom, every heart that dared to listen. The boy I once was had become a man who understood that the greatest power in the world is not authority, wealth, or fear. It is the courage to speak the truth, and the wisdom to know when and how to speak it.